How are you tonight, sir?
Excellent, Leon. How are you?
This is Kimberly. Leonna's running the room tonight.
Okay.
And I want to open tonight's interview with just kind of a brief description of what it is that you have experienced and what is Project Pegasus.
Well, what I experienced was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Project Pegasus was a research and development program undertaken by DARPA. That's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the agency that gave us the Internet. In those years, it was known simply as ARPA. And it had undertaken a small, highly compartmentalized program to develop not so much time travel, but quantum access to past and future events. So it was working not just on means of getting somebody from point A to point B in the time-space continuum, but also simply ways of deriving information, that is, scenes of past and future events. And I was brought into the program as one of the child team members because, for example, they wanted to test the effects of teleportation on children. They were thinking, for example, that if teleportation was implemented secretly to allow, let's say, the president and his family to move between distant points in time-space in a few seconds, that there were times when the members of the presidential family, including children, would go with them. On the other hand, if teleportation was made public, just as in conventional transportation, the adults who were going on various trips would be bringing their kids with them. So they wanted to develop baseline data on the physical and mental effects of teleportation on kids. There were also some technical requirements where they needed small cooperative human beings. And so they created a cadre of gifted and talented school children, and I was one of those kids, and they brought us through a sort of an escalating cascade of different exposures to different forms of time travel. So initially we were doing conventional remote viewing, but then they began to, for example, place us in the Montauk chair, which prompts visits to your own subjective future, sort of astral projections in which you found yourself doing things in your own future, and then you could report back what was going on at that time. Ultimately, my project experiences resulted in physical time travel, both through a Tesla device that was at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, and a Stargate that was located in the small town of Cerrillos, New Mexico. So I'm providing a whistleblower account that affirms the fact that time travel was fully operational by 1970. The U.S. government's secret program that was developing these technologies was so advanced that, in fact, they were involving children in the technical activities, both because they wanted to test the effects on children, because they were training us as America's next generation of chrononauts, that is, time-space explorers, for ultimately what would become a program that would parallel the space program involving the astronauts. And so for the past several years, I've been discussing my experiences in Project Pegasus because I believe that the American people and the people of the world have a right to a true telling of the actual technical history of the latter half of the 20th century, because we're going to be needing teleportation to help achieve planetary sustainability. You know, we're going from a population of roughly 6.5 billion to 9 billion by the year 2045, which is when my generation, born in the early 60s, will be elders. And so I'm speaking out now because, you know, if we're going to implement President Obama's call for change, we have to go back and rediscover what was invented in the United States, but that was then kept secret because it was weaponized, and see if we can create a program of technology transfer to bring these cutting-edge technologies into the public sector and lead the world in creating the positive infrastructure of the 21st century.
I would agree with that. I really would. Now, you and I, before the show started, were talking about how does this work? How does teleportation work? How does time travel work? Because from a physics perspective, it's already been proven to be impossible. And so I think there's some confusion that we think about Star Trek and the pixelation idea, and you are actually saying that that's not, in fact, how it works. So can you share with my audience how it works?
Well, I disagree with the major premise, because not only is time travel possible, but the significance of my experiences and what I'm sharing is that it was achieved and was fully made safe and operational by 1970. So let me distinguish the form of time travel, or that is to say teleportation, that emerged in the mass media in Star Trek in 1966-67, and then what was really going on within the secret quarters of the defense technical community. The form of teleportation depicted on Star Trek involves essentially quantum teleportation, and that involves disintegrating somebody at one location and reintegrating their cells, the molecules that make up their body, at their destination. That's not a viable means, even though many people are working on that so-called quantum teleportation, where you disintegrate something and then reintegrate the pattern of it at another location. The problem with that is that would kill somebody. In fact, we had a discussion of that when I was a child in the program. And yet that was what was being disseminated in the best-produced science fiction show of that era, right, Star Trek. What was going on secretly under the aegis of DARPA was the opposite. What had occurred is that during the latter part of his life, Nikola Tesla was working on a device that derived a form of energy that he called radiant energy that is latent and pervasive in the universe. So the critical scientific development here that the conventional physics community has not had access to, because it's been kept secret as a military weapon, is a device that Tesla invented that derives a form of energy from the universe that physicists haven't even been studying because they haven't had access to the device. Among the properties of this device, that is to say the energy that it derives, is the capacity to open up tunnels in the fabric of time-space. In other words, the universe that we live in, even the space that comprises it, is not a void. In fact, it's extremely dense with energy. In fact, the physicist Dr. David Cummings has calculated that a single meter of space contains more ergs of energy than there are grains of sand on planet Earth. Okay, so we live in an extremely energy-dense cosmos. And what Tesla found was a way to derive this energy from the cosmic void and split the cosmic void open so that the teleportee passes through the universe. And in a similar way, the universe is brought around the teleportee. So when we were jumping through this Tesla device at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, we were finding ourselves moving through a tunnel that, as Jack Pruitt, the man who trained us on the teleporter at Curtiss-Wright, once described it, it was opening up interstitial chasms in the fabric of time-space and doing the opposite of what was then being depicted on Star Trek. And this is one of the ways that science fiction has been used since World War II, which is to introduce the basic notion of something, but confuse the public and foreign governments and so forth about how these technologies really work. And so we were jumping through a field of energy, entering an illuminated tunnel, and then several seconds later popping out as the tunnel closed somewhere else on the surface of the Earth.
Now, do these things, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, the spiral that they had over Norway and more recently over China and in Taiwan, actually those spirals were appearing as far back as '88. Do you think that has something to do with this tunnel technology?
I don't know, because I don't know what created those effects, but I can certainly say that the visual nature of the tunnels that were being opened by the Tesla teleporter in Woodridge, New Jersey, and then there was another one at the Sandia National Labs near Albuquerque where we would jump back to the East Coast, didn't create a spiral effect like that. It was more like an illuminated tunnel where there was kind of a tetrahedral structure to a tripartite set of surfaces that was opening up when we were passing through the quantum hologram. It was more like depictions of wormholes, but not exactly a branching wormhole-like effect. More like you had a device that had split open space so that there were three kind of oblate triangular surfaces that we were moving through very quickly. So it didn't have a circular effect as is depicted, as we find in the Norway spiral and effects.
Did it have any effect on you physically? I mean, did you tingle or were you dizzy or?
Well, it was a very odd experience because you felt like you were moving forward at a great rate of speed, but also sometimes like you were standing still and the walls of the tunnel were being brought around you. I remember that one time I looked down and I felt like I was falling, and then I looked forward and I felt like I was moving through a car, let's say through the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City. Being a kid growing up in New Jersey, I was familiar with that experience. Now, when we were briefed on our involvement in the program at a lecture that was held at an underground amphitheater in Cerrillos, New Mexico, by the defense attaché for the project, which was a young former congressman named Donald Rumsfeld. Secretary Rumsfeld explained that there had been questions about the medical side effects of being inside the tunnel. I mean, this was a new experience for human beings. I mean, we were literally having the universe opened up and moved past us, or we were sort of diving through this opening in the fabric of time-space. And so naturally there were questions about the medical effects of that. And he said that at that time that the only known side effect was that the experience was causing profound dehydration. And so he said when you arrive here in New Mexico, whose environment is, by its very nature, very arid, and you'd be likely to become dehydrated anyway, even if you flew to New Mexico or drove there, just make sure that you drink a lot of water. Well, that's what was known in 1970. That meeting was held in April of 1971. Since then, I've been briefed. For example, I went on a major fact-finding trip about my experiences to New Mexico in June of 2003. And I met Jack Pruitt, who had been one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus, who later went on to become the research director for Project Montauk, which was a kind of a spin-off of Pegasus. And Jack explained to me that I should really watch the glycemic content of the food I was eating and the calories, because they knew by 2003 that the teleportation had caused metabolic disruption in some of the child teleportees of my generation. I have not battled that problem so severely. I've been able to control it through alkalizing, through watching my diet, trying to avoid carbohydrates, trying to get enough exercise. But, you know, Jack was really a hero to step forward like that and risk his security oath and so forth by really helping me disseminate that to the other teleportees. And I might add that the brave airmen and women of this country flying our stealth aircraft need to know that too, because there's a teleportation capability on the B-1 and the B-2 bombers. So it was known when we were little kids in the project 40 years ago that we were, quite frankly, very dehydrated by the time we arrived in New Mexico. It was almost like, you know, hydrophobia, as if we had rabies or something. I remember one time I was standing in a line behind a water fountain in New Mexico, and one kid after the other was actually pushing the kid in front of him out of the way to get access to the water fountain. So it was a pretty profound dehydration effect that was being caused. Now, in the adult participants, adult tissues are more rigid than the tissues of children. For example, their heart linings and so forth. And I was told by Courtney Hunt, who was a CIA contact officer that was placed in my life in 1981, that they also knew that the teleportation was causing heart valve defects in the bodies of some of the adult participants. And now, my father developed a fusing of the flap of his mitral valve, and so that linked up with what we'd experienced back in the early 70s. Now, I'm calling for teleportation to be adopted after these medical effects are resolved, and I wouldn't be surprised if they already have been. But if truth be told, there were pretty profound medical consequences. One thing that happened when I left the program is that my skin on my chest, shoulders, and back opened up, and the dermis down below filled up those gaps, and I have keloid scarring on my chest, shoulders, and back. And so my response to those who say that I didn't experience what I experienced in furtherance of the security of our country, you know, being a child volunteer in a secret defense project like this, is, well, you know, feel my scars. I mean, take a look at the big keloid scar on my chest, for example. Those resulted from the medical side effects of the energy fields that I was being exposed to.
Okay, we have a question in our chat room from Black Unicorn. He says, on time travel, that's the topic, let's see, take a person and excite their molecules and make them unstable, then saturate them with a level of light that existed in a previous point in time, and then excited molecules that will be drawn through an osmosis that greater source of light that the person was saturated with. Does that make sense to you?
No, that's a very eloquent articulation of quantum teleportation. And so when we read articles, for example, in the conventional science press, today, in this time, that's the view of teleportation, that the science press, as a form of propaganda, is trying to misinform the public about what teleportation is. That is a very articulate way of describing one way of disassembling somebody in one location and drawing them into a different state at another location in the time-space continuum. And that can be done. It's already been demonstrated with several molecules. So quantum teleportation is also a viable technology. We could certainly use it, for example, to design a toaster or microwave oven at the factory and then literally teleport it to somebody's house. And that would obviously be an efficient way of moving goods across vast distances. But it's not viable to move living organisms because it would cause them to perish in the process of being disintegrated. So that's a description of the form of teleportation that Star Trek was promoting 40 years ago, but it was not the form of teleportation that the defense technical community had developed and was secretly researching and developing.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take this first caller because he's been waiting for a little while. Caller 502, you are on live with Andrew. Could you give us your name and where you're calling from and what your question is tonight?
Sure. I'm from Teresa, and I'm Teresa, and I'm from Kentucky. And I have a question about Dr. Anderson and his work that he's doing with time control. I'm wondering if Mr. Basiago is familiar with any of that work, and if that's related to what he is saying that he experienced.
That's a great question. Dr. Anderson is certainly a friend and a strategic ally. I appeared on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th of last year, and after I did, Dr. Anderson sent me a very kind email stating to the effect that, Andy, it looks like we encountered different forms of time travel that have been undertaken by DARPA over the last 40 years. And then he appeared on Coast on January 31st of this year and described his work in time warp propagation and time control. So he and I are pretty much on the same page that we've had an exposure to different forms of time travel that have been under development by the U.S. defense community for 40 years. And, of course, because these programs are compartmentalized, I can't speak with authority on what he's developing, and he can't really speak with authority regarding what I was exposed to 40 years ago, because these programs are very tightly held, and we were utterly persuaded to remain quiet about what we were experiencing. I mean, they really made sure that we didn't talk, as children. And he's a very courageous individual in the sense that he's essentially emerging publicly to affirm that time travel has already been developed, and in that sense playing an important role as a whistleblower, as I'm trying to. The critical thing to know is that essentially time travel has been achieved. What I was exposed to primarily was teleportation, which is getting somebody from point A to point B almost instantaneously as a result of opening up a tunnel in the time-space continuum. I was also exposed to a technology called chronovision, where you propagate a hologram that's so dense that it has a lensing effect, and it brings the images from an event going on non-locally in the quantum hologram, what we would call the past or the future, into the laboratory so you can either view that event or if you're standing in the hologram so that you can experience that event. What Dr. Anderson has developed in his career and that he's revealing to along with me, end the quantum cover-up, is the creation of differentials between dimensions so that you draw an energetic effect off of the disequilibrium between the dimension, and that could be an important new energy technology. He's also developed ways to cause a specific microenvironment of the time-space continuum to stop, and he calls that time control. So We're both engaged in the same important cause, which is revealing to the American people and the people of the world that time travel has been achieved. Now we have to implement teleportation to save our planet, and we have to tell the people the truth about the true technical history of the latter half of the 21st century. And, I really laud his efforts, and I think that he was more than kind in writing to me, and after recognizing that I was telling the truth and that I was an actual experiencer. But, of course, he couldn't confirm, let's say, my experiences in the chronovisor any more than I can confirm his time control experiments, because these programs are undertaken in just utmost secrecy. But we knew enough about the different things that have been developed over the last 40 years to certainly know that both of, each of us was telling the truth. I might also add, in regard to Dr. Anderson, that in 2002 he made a very telling statement that I was certainly able to recognize the fact that he's a man of truth, and that was, he stated that the Montauk chair went national in 1970 and involved thousands of American school children. And I could link up that information with my own experiences, because indeed it was in the spring of 1970, in the latter half of my third grade year, that we first began to take astral projections to our own subjective futures in the Montauk chair. And so when I heard Dr. Anderson state that publicly, I thought, well, here's somebody who knows what he's talking about. He has actual project knowledge, and is not just propagating an urban legend regarding time travel. He's sharing actual secret program information with the public. So he's a man of truth. I appreciate the support that he's given me, and I certainly support his truth campaign regarding his own experiments in time-space physics.
Well, I hope that answers your question. I certainly thank you for calling in tonight, and I hope you're enjoying the show.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question and talk to such a great guest.
All right. Thanks, Teresa. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Teresa.
Okay, everybody, we are going to go to a short commercial break right now, and when we return, we will take some more calls and ask some more questions of Mr. Andrew tonight. We'll be right back. All righty then. Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back, Andrew. We have a million questions. Our lines are starting to light up a little bit, but the people in the chat room are asking about your time travel and the Lincoln picture. Is that child that's in the picture you?
Yes, it is, and I will state that to the end of my days. That picture resulted from a journey that I took to Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863, the day that President Lincoln was to give his Gettysburg Address there. I was sent there to view his Gettysburg Address, but unfortunately, because of a set of circumstances that occurred when I was there, I didn't even get a chance to physically see President Lincoln. But I'm the child in that photograph. I was sent there from a time lab in East Hanover, New Jersey in the spring of 1972. At that location, there was a new technology under development called plasma confinement, and they were able, and this was really, I think, the most amazing technology that had been developed by then. They would propagate a cloud of plasma, and then we were trained to walk into that cloud, and yet they could calibrate where you were going to wormhole to in the time-space continuum as a result of entering that cloud. Now, how they did that, I have no idea. That lab was under the direction of somebody who is still alive, and in fact, who I sought out last time I was in New Mexico in 2008. And that was Dr. Sterling Colgate, who would go on to a distinguished career investigating quasars at the Los Alamos National Labs. But that particular technology wasn't teleportation. It produced wormholing, kind of a branching series of wormholes via a localized quantum field effect. And so being enshrouded in this cloud of plasma caused you to fall through the quantum plenum, through a branching series of wormholes, and then pop into view at the location where you were sent. It was explained to me by my late father, who was interacting with, working with Dr. Colgate at that particular facility, that they wanted to put me down on a road that branched off from the major north-south arterial that went through Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In fact, it's still there. And a road that went to the northwest. And the reason they knew these two roads were there is because they're still there. They've just been developed. So they put me down on the side of the road, and I found that I had lost my hat, both of my shoes, and one of my socks. I had been dressed as a Union Bugle Boy because, as it was explained by this woman named Valerie who was working there at that lab, they wanted to dress me in a way where I would just sort of blend into the social environment. And I said, why aren't you going to give me a bugle? And she said, well, you don't play trumpet, Andy. You play saxophone, so and plus we can't send you with metal through this particular quantum access technology. So I was dressed in this spanking brand new, really immaculate Union Bugle Boy uniform, complete with the pantaloon pants and everything and some shiny black shoes. But when I arrived at the side of that road northwest of the town of Gettysburg, I was bereft of my shoes, a sock, and my hat. So I sat down on the ground and I took off the remaining sock and threw it in some bushes because I knew that I would be walking into Gettysburg and I didn't want to look conspicuous. I certainly didn't have any shoes. And my dad said, just start walking in one direction on that road, and the first person you come to, ask them which way Gettysburg is. And I encountered this tall, gaunt Union soldier. He looked like half out of his mind. He looked like he was suffering from combat fatigue, walking along the side of the road. And I said, hey, friend, which way Gettysburg? And he pointed in the direction that I was walking. So I had, it was a coin toss, so I actually had started walking in the right direction towards Gettysburg. It was cold, foggy. I began shivering in the brisk autumn air. It took me, I'd say, maybe about 20 minutes to get into downtown Gettysburg, and I couldn't believe it how undeveloped Gettysburg was down in the downtown. You had these shops that were, let's say, 3 shops per building, and then you had a wooden sidewalk. And the sidewalks attached to each building were broken up, so they were really just sort of wooden porches on the front of the buildings. And it was about, about maybe 8 o'clock in the morning. I had been sent very early from that time lab location in New Jersey, and indeed reached Gettysburg very early in the morning, probably earlier than the morning back in New Jersey in 1972. And I started looking through the shop windows because I was hopefully going to be, getting hold of a jacket and some shoes just so I could feel warmer. I mean, it was November 19th in rural Pennsylvania, so it was quite cold. And a man hobbled up onto the sidewalk. He was about 70 years old. He was limping from what looked like a severe wound to his leg. And he addressed me directly. He said, "Hey, boy, what are you doing What are you doing out here in the cold without your shoes, without a hat, without even a jacket on? You're going to catch your grip," which apparently was a Civil War era term for catching a cold or whatever. So I've identified this man as, by his appearance, by the fact that he was a Gettysburg cobbler, by the fact that he was injured in the leg during the Battle of Gettysburg 4 months previously, and by his volunteer spirit as a man by the name of John Lawrence Burns, who had volunteered both for the War of 1812 as a teenager, and he had actually joined the fight as the Battle of Gettysburg swept past Gettysburg. And he had a skeleton key to this millinery shop, which was a men's accessory shop there in downtown Gettysburg. And he let me into the shop, and he began looking for some shoes for me. And we went to the back of the shop, and he pulled a pair of brown men's street shoes, very oversized for me, like a size 14. They were huge shoes. And he began stuffing packing paper into these old secondhand shoes and shodding my feet with them. He was just basically taking the worst pair of shoes in the shop and giving them to me. He then took me to a storeroom behind the shop where there was a stack of maybe at least 20 jackets, some of them clearly jackets that must have been taken from the battlefield dead there at Gettysburg and cleaned. They didn't have any blood on them or anything, but they had, I could see that some of them had bullet holes through them and so forth. And he found me a Union winter parka that was kind of like a cotton jacket with probably cotton batting inside, sort of the jackets we would wear as little kids in the late 50s and early 60s before, the introduction of down jackets and that sort of thing. And he said, well, that's the best I can do, young man, because the president's going to be here today, and I've got a speech to catch. So he hobbled in front of me out the front of the shop. In fact, let me mention that a woman entered. She must have been the proprietor of the shop that he was working for as a cobbler. And when they had their discussion about why I was in the shop and why he was helping this little street urchin who had stumbled into town to get outfitted with a jacket, and I believe he put a hat on my head, but I'm blocked as to remembering exactly whether he grabbed a hat or not. But with these large, oversized men's shoes, they had a kind of a discussion where I think he was rationalizing, the charity that he was showing, because she seemed a little bit perturbed that I was in the shop so early, certainly. And when that happened, a time effect occurred where time sped up very rapidly and slowed down. So I know that this plasma confinement method, which was still experimental, certainly caused me to experience a quantum environment that was sort of slightly unstable. And that was kind of frightening, because when he was talking to her, his voice sped up very fast and then very slow, and I couldn't even understand what they were saying to each other. So he hobbled out in front of me, limping severely, out to the dais where Lincoln was going to be arriving, which was basically about 3 feet off the ground. It had no columns or top to it at all. It was just a broad wooden platform with patriotic red, white, and blue bunting around it. And when I walked over there, following Mr. Burns over there to the dais, which was right adjacent over to the cemetery, my father had showed me where these things were placed in Gettysburg to await President Lincoln. I walked over to the front of the dais, and I looked to my left, and the man standing there was my father, dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing here? You're back in the time lab in East Hanover." And he ignored me, and then when I pressed the issue, he turned to me and said, "I'm not your father, son." And that was very disturbing, because indeed he was. And he later explained to me that when he turned to his right and saw me at an older age than I was back in his time-space referent back in New Jersey, on the day that he was sent to November 19th of 1863, he realized I was going to be in the program, because in real time back in New Jersey, from his perspective as a time traveler, I was younger. So sometime after my birth, but before 1972, at an earlier time in New Jersey, in real time, my dad had also been sent to Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863. So that was kind of odd, because my own father was disavowing the fact that I was his son, and yet he had just sent me to Gettysburg on the day Lincoln was going to give his address there. So some of my experiences were sort of overwhelming in this sense, because they were so sort of hallucinatory or bizarre in what ultimately ended up happening. So here I find my dad at that location. He clearly didn't address that back at the time lab when I was sent there, because they were always trying to not interfere with what was going to result during a different, particular activity. I then walked over to the left side of the dais, and there were two women dressed in their Sunday best, in their finery, as it were, who were gossiping and talking about me behind their fans. They were sort of standing there and whispering about this, obviously this little carpetbagger who was dressed in adult clothing, indicating that I probably purloined it from the patriotic combat dead that had been laying out in the fields of Gettysburg 4 months earlier. So that kind of bothered me. I was trained to avoid capture and to avoid confined spaces at all, and to avoid public scrutiny. We were trained to kind of blend into the social scene wherever they sent us. In fact, one time they said, if we send you to a place where people put mud on their head, put mud on your head. Blend in. Don't reveal any information. Don't collect anything to take back. Don't change anything. Just go there and observe and try not to be captured or harassed in any way. So I then moved away from the two women, because they were noticing that I was wearing adult clothing, some of it Union military clothing, and also the pants and jersey of a Union bugle boy. And I walked over to the left corner of the dais itself, where there was a very handsome Union officer and a very homely Union officer of a lesser rank standing, slicing an apple and chomping on it. And this guy got right in my face and started quizzing me about, what regiment I was from and where it was bivouacked and why I wasn't with my regiment. And then he finally said, "Are you touched in the head, boy? Have you seen too much of the fight?" And hoping that he would stop pestering me, I said, "Yes, sir, I have." And they both laughed uproariously, which I think shows some of the sort of the coarsening of people's sensibilities, even by 1863, that they were laughing at this poor Union bugle boy who had seen too much in the fight. So I then walked around to the center of the dais again to avoid them, and I thought, I've now encountered my dad, these women who were gossiping about me, and apparently 2 Union officers who must have been part of President Lincoln's security detail or just there to watch the speech. People were starting to gather in much greater numbers. It was getting somewhat warmer, so I wasn't that uncomfortable. So just responding as a result of my training, I walked about 100 paces from the dais toward the opposite direction from where I had been instructed by my father that President Lincoln was going to be arriving on the dais. If you looked right at the dais, Lincoln was going to be arriving from the Wills Hotel over on the far right side of the dais with David Wills, the proprietor of that hotel. And I knew that. So trying to make sure that I didn't screw up this jump and that I wasn't going to be harassed anymore, I walked to the left side of the dais about 100 paces, and I turned my back to the dais, and I looked to my right. And because I was wearing these grossly oversized men's street shoes, which again was a kind of a disconsonant element with my military clothing, I thought, oh great, they're going to see that I'm a carpetbagger and I picked this all off the battlefield. I looked to the opposite direction that Lincoln was going to be arriving in, and I put my left foot forward and my right foot at a 45-degree angle, so that I was hoping that if somebody again started trying to figure out who I was and why I was dressed in this weird combination of military and civilian clothing, that they wouldn't know how oversized my shoes were, because that was the most telltale element that I might have taken some of this clothing from the battlefield. And it was in that position that I was photographed by apparently a local photographer who was up on a ladder, and he was photographing the crowd scene of the citizens of Gettysburg assembling on November 19th of 1863 to see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. That child in that image, in the left foreground of that famous image that was discovered in 1951 and then photoanalyzed as containing a few pixels that showed President Lincoln's head, is me. And in fact, I can even provide some historical information relative to Lincoln's presence on the dais. I think it's virtually certain that that photograph captured President Lincoln arriving on the platform from which he would give his famous Gettysburg Address, because he had not yet arrived when I walked from the dais to that leftward position just to avoid any more public scrutiny. He certainly wasn't on the stage when I was standing in front of it because, he wasn't there yet. We were waiting for his arrival. So I think that I can fill that in for historians of the Civil War. I think it shows him probably sitting down on the dais after being introduced. There was a long, I think it was a 3-hour speech. There was a long-winded speech before he gave his, a 16-minute speech or something, a very short speech, but eloquent and an immortal address by a U.S. president. I did see Lincoln later when in the chronovisor probes they were sending me to Ford's Theater at the time of his assassination to get behind his box and see who shot him. So I did see one view of Abraham Lincoln actually on the day he died, and I can tell you that he was skeletonous. He must have had cancer, because he was absolutely a skeleton by April of 1865. I saw him from the side, sitting in the balcony seat where he was shot. But unfortunately, I didn't see the Gettysburg Address. I later asked my father what it was like, and he said, I don't know why you got so skittish about it. It was just a man with a beard giving a speech on a platform. And I said, Dad, but it was Abraham Lincoln. I mean, I couldn't even stand the apprehension of thinking about that he was going to soon arrive on the stage. Because I was thinking of that 1863 shot of Lincoln looking forward by Alexander Gardner, where he sort of looks like a chimpanzee in a black suit. I mean, I was afraid of Lincoln. I mean, he was as frightening to me as, when you encounter Boo Radley at the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie. He was basically something that I was dreading seeing. And as a result, unfortunately, I had this Bart Simpson moment of being sent to the Gettysburg Address, but not having the opportunity to see President Lincoln deliver it. So it took me a couple weeks to really get over the sting of that perceived failure. But my dad did say that there was one interesting thing that he found about Abraham Lincoln, and that is he had a very high-pitched, stringy voice, as my father described it. And he imitated Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address by saying, it sounded kind of like this, 77 years ago. And he did sort of an imitation of Lincoln. And we now know that Lincoln had Marfan syndrome, which causes a stretching of the ligaments and tendons in the knees and sometimes the vocal cord. So President Lincoln by 1865 was not, or excuse me, that was 1863, was already apparently suffering from the effects of Marfan syndrome in terms of his vocalization. And certainly he was a very ill man by 1865 because he was basically cadaverous sitting there in the chair when I looked over and saw him sitting there in Ford Theater.
That is really amazing. And Andy, I hate to cut you off, but we only have 3 minutes left, and I'm sorry, callers, we did not have time to get to the rest of you. And I have 20 gazillion questions that we didn't get to. Andrew, would you come back to the show and do another show with us?
Certainly, I'd be happy to, Kim.
And people can get a hold of you at projectpegasus.net. Is that correct?
Correct. That's been under development for several months. I am a lawyer in private practice and solo practice, so I really have to complete my website. But that's going to be the home for all of my revelations about Project Pegasus and the campaign that I'm waging to urge the United States government to declassify teleportation so that we can use it to transform the infrastructure of human civilization in the 21st century.
Well, I am very excited about that potential. I'm also very excited to have you back and talk to you more about all of this because you are just a fountain of information, and I am so honored that you agreed to do the show with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. It was very fun. I love your format. It sort of takes us back to the early days of radio where it was truly a show, and I really appreciate being on your show.